The early morning of October 14th, 1066, was unusually foggy and cold. At the top of Senlac Hill, grim warriors stood in tight ranks, clutching heavy wooden shields firmly in their hands. They peered intently into the morning mist, awaiting the inevitable attack by the heavy Norman cavalry. These men were prepared to give their lives not merely for their king, but for the very idea of a united and independent country. At that moment, the fate of the state they had been building piece by piece over many centuries was being decided. How did a few scattered tribes of settlers manage to create a powerful country that would later build the world's largest empire? After all, England did not appear on the map as if by magic one fine day. It was literally pieced together through endless wars, religious conflicts, and difficult compromises. We will trace this incredible journey from the arrival of the first wooden boats carrying mercenaries to the creation of a unified kingdom. This is the complete history of the Anglo-Saxons, whose spirit and culture have forever shaped the character of modern Great Britain. In the early 5th century, the once mighty Roman Empire began to crumble rapidly under the onslaught of barbarian tribes. In 410, the Roman legions left the misty island of Britain for good, leaving the local Celtic population completely defenseless. The old administrative order vanished instantly after the final departure of the Roman legions in the early 5th century. The beautiful stone cities, once teeming with life, began to rapidly fall into complete ruin. All established trade came to a complete halt, leaving the local population without their usual resources. Left without the protection of Roman walls, the Britons found themselves face to face with a harsh reality. The country plunged into deep political chaos before their very eyes, losing all the achievements of ancient civilization. Local British chieftains desperately tried to organize a defense against the looming threat. Their main enemies were the wild northern tribes of the Picts and Scots, who regularly crossed the old borders. These ferocious warriors mercilessly plundered defenseless villages, seizing food and driving off livestock. The fragmented Celtic armies suffered one crushing defeat after another, losing control of their lands. They were catastrophically short of military forces to hold such a long defensive line. The British rulers found themselves on the brink of utter despair, realizing the inevitability of their defeat. In this desperate situation, the Briton leaders made a decision that would forever change the course of world history. Vortigern, an influential Briton chieftain, decided to hire foreign mercenaries to defend his exhausted lands. This ruler realized that without professional military assistance, his people would be completely annihilated. He turned to the fierce Germanic tribes inhabiting the cold shores of the North Sea for salvation. The chieftain's plan seemed incredibly pragmatic and logical, given the realities of those brutal times. Vortigern hoped to use the sharp swords of others to quickly resolve his own territorial problems. Under the terms of this historic treaty, the mercenaries received generous compensation for their dangerous work. Vortigern promised to grant the Germanic tribes fertile lands on the island's eastern coast. In exchange for these territories, the foreigners were to provide loyal and continuous military service. The Britons hoped to create a reliable buffer from them that would absorb the blows of the northern barbarians. At first, this alliance seemed like the ideal solution to a protracted political and military crisis. None of the local rulers suspected at the time what a terrible price they would have to pay for this assistance. Soon, the first long wooden ships, filled with Germanic warriors, landed on the shores of Britain. They were representatives of three major northern peoples: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. These people had come here in search of a better life, fleeing the harsh climate of their homeland. They were armed to the teeth and possessed vast combat experience gained during their sea voyages. At first, the mercenaries did indeed faithfully fulfill their contract, defending the borders of the British territories. The Germanic troops successfully repelled the Picts and Scots, justifying all the resources invested in them. But these hardy men quickly realized their true position on this island. They saw that they were defending incredibly rich and fertile lands that yielded excellent harvests. At the same time, These new lands turned out to be virtually uncontrolled by anyone due to the weakness of the local authorities. The mercenaries closely observed the disunity among their employers and drew some very pragmatic conclusions. They decided they no longer needed to blindly obey the orders of outsiders and weak leaders. A daring plan took shape in the minds of their leaders to seize these territories and make them their own. Hengist and Horsa, legendary brothers and warlords, were the first to launch a large-scale rebellion against the British rulers. These ambitious military leaders openly demanded that Vortigern provide more food and new lands for their people. They blackmailed the Britons by threatening to break the treaty and leave the borders unprotected. Upon receiving a categorical refusal, the brothers immediately turned their deadly weapons against their former allies. The local Celts were completely unprepared for such a fierce and well-organized military assault. The mercenaries' betrayal came as a complete surprise to the British chieftains, paralyzing their resolve. The Germanic warriors began to methodically and mercilessly seize the eastern territories of the island. They advanced deep into the country, ruthlessly burning the remnants of the majestic old Roman settlements. Thus, ordinary mercenaries rapidly transformed into brutal and all-powerful conquerors. They opened a completely new, incredibly bloody chapter in Britain's long history. The Celtic tribes were forced to retreat hastily to the west, leaving their homes behind. News of these vast, rich and defenseless lands could not remain a secret for long. It spread incredibly quickly along the entire northern coast of continental Europe. Tales of easy victories and fertile fields stirred the imaginations of many Germanic chieftains. Soon, this trickle of mercenaries turned into a powerful and uncontrollable flood of colonizers. Thousands of new boats, filled with armed and determined men, rushed toward the shores of England. Now they carried with them not only heavy swords, but also their large families, livestock, and tools.
This was no longer merely a military invasion, but a large-scale migration of entire peoples.
Britain was finally bidding farewell to its ancient Celtic past, entering a new Germanic era. The Celtic population was gradually pushed farther and farther west into the rugged mountains of Wales and Cornwall. In the territories cleared of their former inhabitants, the Germanic tribes began to lay the foundation for their future independent states. By the beginning of the 6th century, the map of Britain had changed beyond all recognition. In the conquered territories, the Anglo-Saxons did not establish a single, unified state, preferring instead to divide themselves into numerous small domains. Gradually, out of the utter post-Roman chaos on the island, the outlines of new political entities began to emerge. The conquerors ceased their chaotic wanderings and began to firmly establish themselves in the fertile territories they had seized. As a result of this lengthy process, a system of 7 major, powerful kingdoms emerged, known to historians as the Heptarchy. This division was not planned in advance by anyone. It was the natural outcome of the balance of power among the various tribes. England became a complex mosaic of independent domains, each desperately fighting for its place in the sun. Each of the Germanic tribes carved out its own specific niche on the new geographical map of Britain. The Angles founded Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia, bringing the vast central and northern lands of the island under their control. The Saxons firmly established themselves in the south and west, creating the ambitious kingdoms of Wessex, Sussex, and Essex. At the same time, the Jutes chose the most advantageous position for themselves, founding the wealthy kingdom of Kent on the English Channel. These young kingdoms quickly sprang up with wooden fortresses and began to impose their harsh rule on the new lands. This era bore no resemblance to the peaceful coexistence of friendly Germanic brother nations bound by a common ancestry. The dynasties were in a state of perpetual war, attempting to seize the best pastures and control over trade routes. One day, an ambitious ruler might proclaim himself supreme king, and the next, his army would perish ingloriously in a bloody ambush. The situation changed so rapidly that yesterday's powerful allies could easily become irreconcilable, mortal enemies. Rulers did not merely wage war, they laid the foundation for the future English nation through constant rivalry and competition. In the crucible of these endless civil wars, the unified and incredibly resilient character of Anglo-Saxon society was gradually forged. It was precisely this harsh experience of survival that taught them to be pragmatic politicians and ruthless warriors. Despite political fragmentation and hostility, all these tribes shared a common language, similar laws, and strict pagan beliefs. Their culture was built on absolute loyalty to the chieftain, who served as their chief protector and provider. The ruler generously rewarded his most loyal warriors with gold rings, captured weapons, and fertile land. Society was strictly divided into free warrior landowners, ordinary artisans, and slaves, whose lives were valued extremely low. This rigid hierarchy allowed for iron discipline to be maintained, even amid constant and unpredictable military threats. The center of the tribe's entire social and political life was a spacious wooden hall that towered majestically over the settlement. Within these broad walls, the warriors feasted boisterously, divided the spoils of war fairly, and discussed matters of vital state importance. On long winter evenings, the warriors listened to ancient epic tales sung by wandering poets to the monotonous strains of the harp. Over time, brutal military skirmishes gradually gave way to complex diplomatic alliances. Rulers realized that endless slaughter severely depleted resources and hindered the accumulation of real material wealth. Dynastic marriages became a new and effective political weapon, allowing territories to be united without mass bloodshed. This relative political stability immediately led to the conclusion of lucrative trade agreements between former rivals. The Kingdom of Kent, thanks to its advantageous location on the strait, was the first to establish profitable ties with continental Europe. Anglo-Saxon merchants began actively trading valuable local wool and metals for luxurious fabrics, wine, and precious stones. New trading settlements sprang up rapidly at the junctions of convenient river routes, gradually transforming into thriving cities. The island's economy began to slowly revive, filling the royal treasuries with real, ringing silver coins. Such rapid economic growth inevitably demanded greater stability, which gradually paved the way for sweeping spiritual changes. The harsh pagan gods of war, whom the settlers worshipped, were well suited to a bloody era of conquest and destruction. However, effective governance of complex, expanding states required a completely different, more universal system of values. Paganism could not provide kings with literate scribes, written laws, or a developed, reliable bureaucratic apparatus. The Anglo-Saxon elites began to clearly understand that their old faith was a major obstacle to the further development of a fully fledged state. The eyes of far-sighted Anglo-Saxon monarchs increasingly turned toward the powerful Catholic Church on the continent. Christianity promised not only spiritual salvation, but also powerful ideological support for supreme, centralized royal authority. Integration into the European religious family would open up rapid access to cutting-edge knowledge, Latin literature, and new technologies of governance. This pragmatic political calculation ultimately prepared the harsh British land for the imminent arrival of the first unarmed missionaries. In 597, a small but incredibly determined group of foreign missionaries landed on the coast of Kent. Augustine of Canterbury, an envoy of the Pope, had been tasked with converting the rugged Anglo-Saxons to the Christian faith. Augustine of Canterbury was a Roman missionary tasked with converting the fierce Anglo-Saxons to the new Christian faith. He proceeded with great caution, beginning his preaching at the royal court of Kent, where he was warmly received by the Christian queen. The French princess Bertha had long been a follower of this religion and had already prepared fertile ground for the missionaries. Thanks to her immense influence, the preachers were granted safe haven and official permission to speak freely with the local people. The ruler of the kingdom listened attentively to the priest's arguments, carefully weighing all the political and spiritual risks of such a step. Ethelbert I, King of Kent, was the first of the Anglo-Saxon monarchs to decide to officially undergo the rite of baptism. He soon agreed to renounce the old idols, setting a crucial example for all the other rulers of the British Isles. Following their king, thousands of his loyal warriors and common subjects entered the river en masse to be baptized. This historic event marked the beginning of a large-scale and incredibly profound spiritual transformation of the entire fragmented Anglo-Saxon society. The diplomatic success in Kent opened the door for the further spread of the new, peaceful faith throughout all other regions. However, the Christianization of Britain was by no means an instantaneous process and was often accompanied by serious political resistance. Many powerful rulers sincerely feared angering the old pagan gods who had brought them good fortune in endless battles. Warriors believed that renouncing the faith of their ancestors would inevitably lead to defeat on the battlefield and the loss of their lands. Priests of the old cults actively incited the common people against foreign priests in strange, long robes. In some northern kingdoms, missionaries had to literally flee for their lives from the wrath of an enraged pagan mob. Because of this religious conflict, it often happened that after the death of a baptized king, the situation would change dramatically. His legitimate heir would immediately return the country to its familiar pagan ways, brutally destroying the Christian altars that had been built. Such painful setbacks regularly occurred in Northumbria and Essex, severely hindering the process of national unification. Nevertheless, the new faith slowly but incredibly steadily took firm root in the harsh British soil. The monks showed remarkable perseverance, returning time and again to dangerous lands to continue their arduous mission.
Along with the new religion, these selfless monks brought with them the art of writing, which radically transformed life.
With the emergence of the first stone monasteries, England began to rapidly integrate into Europe's unified cultural and educational network. Until then, the Anglo-Saxons had used only primitive runes, which were completely unsuitable for conducting government affairs. The priests taught the local elite the Latin alphabet, opening new horizons for the development of diplomacy and international trade. In addition, the monks painstakingly copied ancient books, carefully preserving the precious knowledge of antiquity for future generations. During this period, the Venerable Bede emerged onto the historical stage, an outstanding English monk and scholar who wrote the first fundamental work on the history of his people. The rulers of the Seven Kingdoms very quickly realized the enormous political benefits of such a close alliance with the Church. Priests legitimized the monarch's power by proclaiming them anointed by God, rather than merely lucky and ruthless warlords. This new elevated status made the king's person absolutely sacred and inviolable in the eyes of all the common people. Any rebellion against the legitimate ruler was now equated with the gravest sin against the Creator himself. Across the country, the active construction of majestic stone temples began, permanently replacing the old wooden pagan shrines. It was during this prosperous period that the kingdoms of Northumbria and Mercia reached the peak of their cultural and economic power. They became major centers of Christian learning, attracting the finest artisans and scholars from all over continental Europe. In the north of the country, rich libraries and cutting-edge artistic workshops of an incredible world-class standard were springing up. Local rulers generously funded the creation of magnificent ecclesiastical artifacts, wishing to demonstrate their boundless devotion to the faith. Offa, the powerful king of Mercia, who subjugated his neighbours and built a gigantic earthen rampart on the border with Wales, became the symbol of this great era. This ruler was so influential that he conducted diplomatic negotiations on a completely equal footing with the Frankish emperor himself. Under the reliable protection of such powerful monarchs, Anglo-Saxon artisans created stunning gold jewellery of the highest quality. They produced exquisitely illuminated gospels with incredibly intricate ornamentation, genuinely astonishing all of enlightened Europe.
No one at the time even suspected that a new and terrifying threat was already looming from the east, ready to destroy all these achievements.
At the end of the 8th century, a completely unexpected and merciless blow struck the coasts of the flourishing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Vikings arrived from Scandinavia in their fast ships, seeking easy prey and new fertile lands. At first, these were merely swift raiding expeditions against the richest and utterly defenseless coastal monasteries. The Scandinavian ships would suddenly emerge from the morning mist, leaving the local inhabitants not the slightest chance to organize a defense. Monks, in sheer terror, recorded in their chronicles how the savage pagans mercilessly slaughtered unarmed priests right at the altars. The attackers coolly took the church's gold, precious chalices, and richly illustrated books that had been accumulated in the abbeys over centuries. These sudden strikes from the sea sowed genuine panic among the Anglo-Saxons, who had never before faced such a ruthless enemy. For a long time, British rulers naively believed that the northern pirates would limit themselves to seasonal raids on coastal areas. The kings dispatched small detachments to guard the coast, hoping to easily scare off the uninvited guests with the clang of weapons. But these initial isolated attacks turned out to be merely a bloody reconnaissance mission, preceding a real, carefully planned, full-scale invasion.
The Vikings carefully studied the coastline, assessing the weakness of the scattered Anglo-Saxon armies and the wealth of the island's inland regions.
Having gathered enough information, the Scandinavian chieftains returned home to prepare a strike of unprecedented destructive power. They knew exactly where and when to strike to encounter minimal resistance. In 865, the political situation on the island changed in the most catastrophic way possible. It was not just another band of raiders that landed on the shores of East Anglia, but a massive, well-organized great heathen army. Ivar the Boneless, a ruthless and brilliant Viking tactician, led his invincible forces not for a fleeting raid, but to completely conquer the country. Under his command were thousands of battle-hardened veterans, united by a thirst for new fertile lands and eternal glory. This gigantic army advanced deep into the country, methodically and ruthlessly destroying the old Anglo-Saxon kingdoms one by one. The well-oiled military machine of the Scandinavians seemed utterly invincible to the scattered British forces. Mighty Northumbria, torn apart by internal strife, was the first to fall under the onslaught of this Scandinavian steel roller. Its self-assured rulers were taken captive and brutally executed to demoralize any attempts at further resistance. The wealthy and ancient city of York was instantly transformed into the new, well-fortified military capital of the triumphant Vikings. The occupiers began actively rebuilding the city's fortifications, preparing for a protracted and large-scale war on the island. For the scattered and poorly trained British forces, a clash with such an army came as a true military shock. Soon, the same tragic fate befell Mercia and East Anglia, which were unable to unite in the face of a common threat. Their rightful kings either died heroically but in vain in unequal battles, or cowardly fled across the sea to save their lives. The old Anglo-Saxon elite, which had ruled these lands for centuries, was almost completely wiped out in just a few years. On the conquered and blood-soaked lands, the victors immediately began to impose their own harsh laws. The local population was burdened with heavy taxes and forced to work for their new foreign masters. The British Isles were rapidly transforming into a new Scandinavian province, where power belonged exclusively to the strongest. Realizing that resistance had been crushed, the Vikings began to settle actively and in large numbers in the conquered, fertile territories. They brought their large families from Scandinavia, divided up the best farmland, and established their own fortified settlements. The unique culture and Christian faith that the Anglo-Saxons had painstakingly built up over 4 long centuries found themselves on the brink of complete physical annihilation. Wessex remained the last bastion of desperate resistance, standing alone in the south of the island amid its conquered neighbours. Its rulers watched with horror as their once great allies fell, fully aware that they would be the next target. The Vikings wasted no time and immediately directed all their accumulated military might against this last stronghold. The military campaign that had begun turned into a veritable catastrophe for the exhausted defenders of Wessex. The Anglo-Saxon troops suffered one heavy and bloody defeat after another, unable to withstand the onslaught of the enemy's superior forces. The royal army was rapidly losing control of its key cities and strategically important crossings. Panic and a deep sense of utter hopelessness began to spread rapidly among soldiers and ordinary citizens alike. The defending forces were dwindling before their very eyes, and many aristocrats were seriously considering surrendering to the victor's mercy. It seemed that the great history of the Anglo-Saxons had reached its tragic, yet entirely logical conclusion. At this darkest hour in history, when hope had nearly faded, a man of remarkable destiny ascended the throne of Wessex. Alfred the Great, the young king of Wessex, possessed an outstanding analytical mind and incredible strategic foresight. Unlike his predecessors, he understood that defeating the Vikings in direct combat was now physically impossible. He needed to buy precious time at any cost to rethink the entire strategy for waging this hopeless war. Alfred was destined to accomplish the impossible and save his nation from complete oblivion. But first, this young ruler had to endure the most terrifying and humiliating ordeal of his life. In the winter of 878, the Viking army launched a sudden and devastating attack, capturing the royal residence right in the middle of the festivities. Alfred miraculously escaped death in the carnage and was forced to flee hastily into the impassable, icy marshes of Æthelstan. In an instant, the powerful monarch lost absolutely all visible symbols of his legitimate authority. Yet in these gloomy marshes, he retained an unshakable faith in his salvific mission, one that would soon alter the entire course of history.
It was in these gloomy marshes that the strategy was born that would soon turn the tide of this entire bloody war.
In the spring of 878, Alfred the Great sent secret messengers to every corner of his occupied kingdom. Loyal Anglo-Saxon warriors began secretly gathering at Egbert's Stone, answering the desperate call of their rightful monarch. In May 878, Alfred secretly summoned his loyal men from all the remaining free counties to Egbert's Stone. Having assembled a powerful militia, the king moved swiftly to confront the unsuspecting Viking army. The Anglo-Saxon warriors were incredibly exhausted from long months of guerrilla warfare, but their fighting spirit was at its absolute peak. They understood perfectly well that this decisive battle would be their last chance to reclaim their homeland. In the historic Battle of Edington, these men charged the enemy with the incredible fury of soldiers who had nothing left to lose. The clash between the two armies was exceptionally brutal, but the Vikings' famous wall of shields ultimately could not withstand the powerful onslaught. The Scandinavian invaders were completely routed in the open field and fled in panic to their fortified stronghold at Chippenham. Alfred did not recklessly storm the high walls, but instead encircled the enemy camp in a tight and merciless siege. 2 weeks later, hunger and utter despair broke the pride of the fierce northern warriors. Trapped inside the fortress, the Vikings, for the first time in their history, begged for mercy and offered the English king peace negotiations. The resounding victory at Edington by no means signaled the immediate and complete expulsion of the Scandinavians from the British Isles. Alfred understood perfectly well that his exhausted kingdom simply lacked the resources to completely annihilate all the invaders in the north. Instead of continuing the bloody war, the king demonstrated remarkable diplomatic wisdom and pragmatism. He signed a historic peace treaty with the Viking leader, which officially divided the country into two independent parts. The southern lands remained under Anglo-Saxon control, while the north and east became a vast region governed by Danish law, known as Danelaw. The most important aspect of this agreement was not the territory, but King Alfred of Wessex' brilliant ideological victory. Guthrum, the ruthless leader of the Viking army, unexpectedly agreed to convert to Christianity following his defeat. Alfred personally became the godfather of his former mortal enemy, cementing this fragile peace with sacred vows. This baptism carried immense symbolic significance, transforming a savage pagan chieftain into the legitimate Christian ruler of the neighboring lands. In this way, Alfred gained precious time for peace, which was vital for the fundamental restructuring of his entire kingdom. Realizing that new Viking raiding parties could return from across the sea at any moment, the king embarked on a large-scale military reform. The traditional peasant militia was utterly ineffective for waging protracted wars, as the men constantly laid down their arms to tend to the harvest. Alfred solved this problem by ingeniously dividing all his available troops into two equal parts. While one group of warriors worked the fields and fed the country, the other performed continuous military service in full combat readiness. This simple rotation allowed Wessex to always have a professional army at its disposal, without undermining the fragile agricultural economy. In parallel with the military reform, the king undertook a comprehensive restructuring of his kingdom's entire defensive infrastructure. A complex system of fortified towns, known as burghs, was built along the country's entire border. These settlements were surrounded by high earthen ramparts, sturdy wooden walls, and deep moats. No village in Wessex was now more than a day's journey from these reliable fortified walls. This dense network of impregnable burghs permanently deprived the Vikings of their main tactical advantage, the elements of surprise and mobility. Having established a reliable military shield, Alfred launched an unprecedented program of national cultural revival. He rightly believed that the terrible Viking invasion was God's punishment for the decline of learning and morality among the Anglo-Saxons. He sought to make higher learning accessible to all free people, not just a narrow ecclesiastical elite. It was during this ruler's reign that the compilation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle began, the principal and most comprehensive historical document of that era. This seminal work enabled the English to see themselves as a single people with a great past and a shared historical destiny. The new military and administrative system faced its greatest test during the final years of the king's life. In 892, huge new Viking fleets once again attempted to invade the island's rich southern lands. This time, however, they faced not a disorganized militia, but a powerful network of fortresses and a professional, mobile army. The invaders failed to capture a single major city and, exhausted by the Anglo-Saxons' constant attacks, were forced to flee the country in disgrace.
This ruler not only permanently halted the advance of the invincible pagan army, but also laid a solid foundation for the future unification of the country.
Alfred's heirs would inherit the perfect tool that would soon allow them to reclaim all lost English territories. By the early 10th century, the initiative in the war had definitively passed into the hands of Alfred the Great's descendants. Edward the Elder, Alfred's son, proved to be an outstanding commander and a brilliant strategist. The legacy of the great Alfred lay not only in his military triumphs, but also in passing on his mission to his rightful heirs. Edward the Elder, the king's son, together with his talented sister Æthelflaed, continued the ambitious project of unifying the country. They worked in perfect harmony, combining the rich resources of Wessex with the strategically important territories of neighbouring Mercia. This was a unified and cohesive dynastic project aimed at completely expelling the Scandinavian invaders from the island. The brother and sister understood perfectly well that passive defense was no longer sufficient, and they shifted to an aggressive, systematic offensive. Their military strategy relied on a slow but absolutely irreversible advance deep into enemy territory. They did not simply defeat the enemy in open battle, leaving the lands defenseless against new raids. Instead, immediately after a victory, they began building new fortified burghs on the liberated lands. This tactic of systematically driving the enemy out through fortification proved incredibly effective and deadly for the Scandinavians. The Viking armies, accustomed to swift, maneuverable raids, found themselves completely helpless in the face of this unbroken line of new fortresses. Step by step, the united Anglo-Saxon armies regained control of the eastern and central regions of the British Isles. The local population, utterly exhausted by the Vikings' harsh extortions and cruelty, joyfully welcomed the soldiers from Wessex. Ordinary people greeted them not as yet another group of conquerors, but as long-awaited and rightful liberators. Peasants voluntarily supplied the advancing troops with fresh provisions and actively helped build new defensive structures. This widespread popular support became the most important factor in the rapid military success of the entire royal dynasty. However, the royal family was not naive and knew how to demonstrate an iron fist when necessary. Edward the Elder ruthlessly suppressed any attempts at rebellion, whether from the remaining Danes or from disgruntled local lords. He forcefully annexed the newly liberated lands directly into his expanding kingdom, erasing old historical borders. The Wessex dynasty finally ceased to be merely the rulers of a single southern region, transforming into the undisputed leaders of the entire nation. The long-held dream of a unified Anglo-Saxon state began to take on very real and distinct contours. The country's final unification took place under Alfred's grandson, who triumphantly completed this long-standing family project. Æthelstan was the first monarch to officially assume the title of King of all the English, uniting the island under his rule. He proved to be an incredibly ambitious, intelligent, and highly educated ruler, fully worthy of his great ancestors. In 927, his army triumphantly captured the wealthy city of York, driving out the last independent Viking king. This brilliant military victory permanently erased the old borders of the Danelaw from the political map of the British Isles. Having secured his external borders, the young monarch immediately set about standardizing the internal administration of his vast realm. Æthelstan strictly centralized the minting of silver coins, ensuring the circulation of a single, reliable currency throughout the entire country. However, England's rapidly growing unified power greatly alarmed its numerous northern and western neighbours. The surrounding rulers clearly understood that the ambitious Wessex dynasty might soon set its sights on their territories. Driven by a shared fear, they decided to join forces and launch a powerful preemptive strike against the young kingdom. In 937, a massive coalition of Scots, Irish, and the remaining Vikings invaded the northern borders of Æthelstan's kingdom. The opposing forces clashed in the epic and incredibly bloody Battle of Brunanburh, which decided the fate of the entire island. The Anglo-Saxon army, led by the king and his brothers, fought with the absolute determination of a united and cohesive people. They achieved a historic victory, inflicting a crushing defeat on the coalition and scattering the enemy troops across the surrounding fields. By the end of the day, 5 enemy kings and 7 powerful Viking earls lay dead in the mud. This battle definitively cemented England's status as a unified, sovereign, and absolutely indivisible, powerful state. The Wessex dynasty finally secured long-term peace for the country, allowing the nation to focus on internal development. The ruined stone monasteries were carefully restored, once again becoming strong centers of spirituality and religious education. Scholarly monks returned to their peaceful work, restoring the lost cultural heritage of the previous turbulent centuries. Agriculture recovered rapidly as peasants returned to the fields that had served as battlefields for decades. The great dream of a united, peaceful, and prosperous England, born in the darkest days of the invasions, became a splendid reality.
But this golden age was short-lived, as England's wealth once again attracted greedy eyes from across the sea.
At the end of the 10th century, the menacing shadow of a Scandinavian invasion once again loomed over a prosperous England. Ethelred the Unready, a weak and extremely indecisive king, whose reign turned into a veritable disaster for the country. Instead of repelling the new Viking raiding parties, he began paying them a huge tribute known as the Danegeld. This cowardly policy of constant bribes led to an entirely predictable and tragic outcome. The number of raiders along the coasts only increased as they sensed the weakness of the central authority. Silver literally flowed like a river from the royal treasury into the holds of the Scandinavian ships. Local lords began to rapidly lose faith in the king's ability to protect their lands from repeated ruin. The country began to fall apart politically as regional leaders sought their own means of survival. Ethelred the Unready found himself in a desperate situation, having finally realized that gold could no longer buy long-term peace. In an attempt to resolve the growing problem through radical means, the monarch made a fateful decision that stained his name with eternal shame. On November 13th, 1002, the king secretly ordered the merciless slaughter of all Danes living peacefully in England. This bloody massacre came as a true shock to the entire civilized world of that time. Innocent families, mercenaries, and settlers who had long since integrated into English society were brutally murdered right on the streets. Æthelred naively hoped to eliminate a potential internal threat to his precarious throne in this way. However, instead of the security he expected, he only provoked the incredible wrath of the powerful Danish monarch who swore to take brutal revenge. Among the numerous victims of this treacherous massacre was the Danish ruler's own sister, which made the conflict deeply personal. Sven the Bearded, the stern ruler of Denmark, immediately led a massive fleet of retribution to the shores of England. Sven Forkbeard's army systematically captured key English cities, encountering virtually no serious organized resistance. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, deeply disillusioned with their incompetent and cruel king, began committing treason en masse. One after another, influential earls defected to the powerful enemy, saving their wealth and titles. They saw the Danish monarch as a stronger and more reliable guarantor of stability than their own cowardly ruler. By the end of 1013, the political and military situation had become utterly hopeless for the English crown. Æthelred was forced to flee the country in disgrace, cowardly abandoning his people to the mercy of a cruel fate. He found a safe haven in Normandy, leaving his throne vacant in the face of the triumphant victor. Sven the Bearded enjoyed his absolute triumph for only a short time, dying suddenly a few weeks after his victory. After his death, full authority over conquered England passed to his young and incredibly pragmatic son, Canute the Great, a far-sighted Danish prince who became King of England, brilliantly managed to reconcile the conquerors and the vanquished. He understood perfectly well that ruling a vast foreign country solely through brute force would be physically impossible. The new monarch chose the wise path of political integration, refraining from mass repression against the local Anglo-Saxon nobility. Canute the Great quickly established himself as an exceptionally just and wise ruler for all his subjects. He fully preserved the old Anglo-Saxon laws, ensuring that the population had a familiar and understandable legal system. The Danish king also actively supported the local Christian church, generously endowing English monasteries and bishops. Under Canute, a country weary of endless wars enjoyed 2 decades of long-awaited peace and stable economic growth. However, this golden age of stability rested solely on the strength of character and charisma of the great king himself. After Canute's death in 1035, his vast Scandinavian empire began to rapidly fall apart at the seams. A series of short, bloody, and utterly unsuccessful reigns by his Danish successors plunged England back into political chaos. The brutal struggle for the throne among the pretenders severely depleted the state treasury and ruined many peaceful counties. In 1042, the political pendulum swung back, and the crown peacefully returned to the old Wessex dynasty. Edward the Confessor, a deeply religious Anglo-Saxon prince who had spent many years in political exile in Normandy, was gladly invited to the English throne, giving the nation a brief hope for a complete national revival. Unfortunately, Edward proved to be an extremely weak politician, completely out of touch with the realities of his native country. He became entirely dependent on the support of powerful local earls, especially the ambitious and wealthy Godwin family. His reign was marked by constant intrigues between the English aristocracy and the king's Norman favourites.
But the greatest tragedy was that the devout Edward never left behind a direct, legitimate heir.
In January 1066, the elderly King Edward the Confessor passed away quietly in his palace, leaving the country on the brink of disaster. The absence of a direct heir instantly triggered the most acute political crisis, unprecedented since the Viking invasions. Several incredibly ambitious world leaders simultaneously laid claim to the vacant English throne. The death of the childless Edward the Confessor created a dangerous power vacuum that threatened to tear the country apart. The English aristocracy fully understood the gravity of the situation and the need for swift, decisive action. Influential lords and the high clergy hastily convened a traditional council to prevent an inevitable civil war. They desperately needed a strong and experienced ruler capable of uniting the nation in the face of external threats. The council categorically rejected the claims of the late king's young and weak relatives, making a pragmatic choice in favor of actual military strength. As a result of this emergency meeting, Harold Godwinson, the most influential and wealthiest earl in the country, was elected the new king. Harold II was an experienced military commander and the de facto ruler of the realm during the final years of Edward's life, when the old monarch had already stepped down from affairs of state. He accepted the crown with incredible haste, holding the ceremony at Westminster Abbey on the very day of his predecessor's funeral. This decisive move was intended to show the whole world that the English throne would not remain vacant for even a single minute. The new king immediately began organizing the defense of the southern coast, fully aware that his accession would not go unanswered. Harold II counted on the loyalty of his army, but even he could not have imagined the scale of the storm bearing down on him. However, this hasty political decision sparked incredible fury on the other side of the narrow English Channel. William the Bastard, the ruthless and determined Duke of Normandy, had been hatching plans to seize the English throne for many years. He loudly claimed that Edward the Confessor had personally promised to hand over power to him many years earlier. Moreover, William claimed that Harold himself had previously sworn a sacred oath of allegiance to him on the holy relics. The Norman ruler immediately declared the new English king a perjurer and a treacherous usurper of legitimate authority. William began actively assembling a massive invasion army, recruiting mercenaries and adventurers from virtually all over Europe. He even managed to secure the official political support of the Pope, who sent him his blessed banner. This cunning diplomatic move instantly transformed his ordinary military campaign into something resembling a holy crusade.
Across the entire coast of Normandy, axes clattered ceaselessly as craftsmen hurriedly built hundreds of new landing ships.
This gigantic fleet was intended to transport thousands of knights, clad in heavy armor and their war horses, across the strait. Preparations were carried out on an incredible scale, transforming Normandy into a single military camp, awaiting a favorable wind. As if the deadly threat from the south were not enough, clouds of yet another invasion were gathering in the far north. Harold the Fierce, the legendary King of Norway and the greatest Scandinavian warrior of his time, had also resolved to seize the English throne. This veteran, hardened by endless battles, saw England as the perfect opportunity to expand his vast northern empire. His ambitious plan was unexpectedly supported by Harold Godwinson's own brother, Count Tostig, who had been exiled from the country. Driven by a blind thirst for revenge, Tostig provided the Norwegians with vital intelligence and brought his own ships. This unnatural alliance between a brother and the nation's enemies made the situation absolutely critical for King Harold II. In September 1066, a massive Norwegian fleet consisting of hundreds of drakars entered the mouth of the River Humber. The arrival of Harold the Fierce's army immediately sowed genuine terror and panic among the entire local northern population. The Vikings landed on the shore and began advancing rapidly toward York, easily crushing the local Anglo-Saxon militias. At the Battle of Fulford, they dealt a crushing defeat to the northern earls, demonstrating their terrifying military might. England found itself caught in a deadly vice between the two greatest military machines of medieval Europe at that time. King Harold II demonstrated remarkable military composure and true tactical genius in this seemingly hopeless situation. Upon learning of the bloodthirsty Norwegians' landing, he made the only correct, yet incredibly risky strategic decision. The monarch led his army north on a forced march, covering enormous distances at a speed unthinkable for that time. In the historic Battle of Stamford Bridge, the Anglo-Saxons, exhausted from their march, suddenly descended upon the unsuspecting Viking camp. The Scandinavian warriors, expecting a peaceful handover of hostages, had left their heavy chainmail on their ships, which proved to be their fatal mistake. The battle was incredibly brutal, devolving into a bloody hand-to-hand struggle that lasted until late into the evening. This grueling battle ended in a complete, unconditional, and glorious victory for the English forces. Harold the Fierce and the traitor Tostig fell in battle, bringing the long era of the great Scandinavian invasions of the British Isles to a permanent close. However, Harold II had absolutely no time to celebrate this triumph, as the winds were already shifting in the south. But the Anglo-Saxon warriors did not even have time to bandage their wounds or mourn their fallen comrades. No sooner had the victory cries in the north died down than Harold received the most dreadful news of his life. The wind in the English Channel had shifted, and Duke William's army landed unopposed on the southern coast of England. Exhausted by battles and long marches, The Anglo-Saxon army was forced to turn around immediately and go into battle once again. The country was rapidly approaching the most tragic and pivotal day in its history. On October 14th, 1066, two great armies finally clashed on the battlefield near the small town of Hastings. The Anglo-Saxons took up a favourable position atop Senlac Hill, forming their famous and impenetrable wall of shields. The Norman knights launched attack after attack against these dense ranks, only to fail time and again, suffering heavy losses from the English axes. The battle raged all day, and the balance of power constantly shifted back and forth. But the Normans' discipline and cunning ultimately played a decisive role in the outcome of this epic battle. Duke William ordered his troops to stage a feigned retreat to lure the English from their fortified hill. Believing victory was theirs, some of the Anglo-Saxon warriors broke ranks and rushed in pursuit of the enemy. At that moment, the heavy Norman cavalry turned and mercilessly crushed the defenders who had broken ranks. The wall of shields crumbled, and the battle turned into a chaotic and brutal hand-to-hand slaughter. In the ensuing confusion, King Harold was killed. According to legend, he received a fatal arrow wound to the eye. King Harold's death marked the final chapter of the independent Anglo-Saxon state, which had been built over 6 centuries. The army was completely routed, and the cream of the national aristocracy lay dead in the blood-soaked mud of Hastings. On Christmas Day, 1066, William the Conqueror was solemnly crowned at Westminster Abbey. The new rulers began to brutally suppress any attempts at resistance, burning entire villages in the north of the country. England was covered with a network of gloomy stone castles, from which the Norman barons controlled the subjugated population. The old Anglo-Saxon elite was completely stripped of its lands, which were distributed among Norman knights. French became the official language of the royal court, the judiciary, and the highest echelons of aristocratic society. Ancient laws and customs were rewritten to suit the new, harsh feudal system of governance. It seemed as though the culture of the founders of this state had been forever wiped from the face of the earth by the conqueror's merciless iron boot. However, the complete physical and cultural annihilation of a vast people proved an impossible task even for the Normans. While the aristocracy spoke French, the common peasants stubbornly continued to use their native language.
Anglo-Saxon traditions of local self-government proved so effective that William chose to preserve them.
Gradually, over many generations, the victors and the vanquished began to slowly intermingle. This painful synthesis gave rise to an entirely new nation that would forever change the political map of the world. Centuries after Hastings, it became clear that the Anglo-Saxons had by no means vanished in the flames of the Norman conquest. Their ancient language, having passed through the crucible of French influence, evolved into modern English, spoken today by the entire world. The basic words expressing the most important human concepts, home, land, friend, love, remain fundamentally Anglo-Saxon. They retained their remarkable simplicity and power, having survived a millennium of linguistic occupation. It was a quiet but utterly triumphant cultural victory of a conquered people over their conquerors. The legal system established by Alfred the Great became a solid foundation for the famous English common law. The concept that a king should rule, not only by the sword, but also with the consent of the wise, grew into the idea of parliamentarism. The county boundaries, drawn as far back as the Heptarchy, have largely remained on the country's administrative map to this day. The Normans brought centralization and stone castles to England, but the very essence of the state remained deeply Anglo-Saxon. Without this strong foundation, the creation of the global British Empire would have been simply physically impossible. Modern England is a direct descendant of those rugged warriors who once gathered on Senlac Hill. Their names have long since been erased from their gravestones, but their genes, culture, and institutions continue to live on in every day of the modern nation. 3 Germanic tribes did not merely seize a patch of land on the edge of Europe, they literally forged it into the future center of the world. And this process of creation, through pain, compromise, and struggle, is the most valuable lesson of British history.